a horse in the Senate, a fiddle over a burning city. Rome's mad emperors, some of it's true. Most of it is propaganda written by the men who replaced them. Tonight, we separate the men from the myths. Let's go back in time and see what happened. Rome, 37 AD. A 24-year-old man has just become the most powerful person alive. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, nicknamed Caligula, Little Boots, after the miniature soldier's sandals he wore as a child living among his father's troops, became emperor in 37 AD at just 24 years old, following the death of his great-uncle Tiberius. He was initially popular. Then, 7 months into his reign, he fell seriously ill. He recovered. Almost everything that follows in the ancient record happens after that illness, and almost everything we know about it comes from 2 writers, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, both working close to a century later, describing the emperor purely through the lens of the dynasty that violently replaced his own. The most famous story is the one about his horse. According to legend, Caligula appointed his prized racehorse, Incitatus, to the consulship, the highest elected office in Rome. Here's the actual ancient testimony. Suetonius writes that Caligula designated the horse to the consulship. Cassius Dio says he promised to make the appointment. Neither historian claims it actually happened. What we do know is that Incitatus lived in genuine luxury. A marble stable, an ivory feeding trough, a collar of precious stones, and a full staff of servants. And that Caligula invited the horse to dinner parties. Modern historians largely agree the consul line was never a literal plan. It was almost certainly a joke, and a pointed one. One theory, from historian David Woods, suggests the horse's name, Incitatus, meaning swift, was a deliberate jab at a specific consul of the era named Asinius Sella, whose own name translates roughly to swift donkey. In other words, a savage political insult dressed up over centuries into a story about literal madness. That doesn't mean Caligula was a stable, reasonable ruler being unfairly maligned. Even accounting for hostile sources, the pattern of behavior that survives is genuinely disturbing. He had political rivals executed on flimsy pretexts, reportedly forced senators to watch as he humiliated their wives, and declared himself a living god late in his reign, going so far as ordering a temple built in his own honor. He was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard in 41 AD, stabbed to death in a palace corridor after a reign of less than 4 years. So which is it? Genuine tyrant or victim of the best smear campaign in ancient history? Modern historians increasingly land somewhere in the middle. A young, inexperienced ruler, possibly suffering from a real illness that changed his behavior after that first year, whose actual failures were then exaggerated into theater by a senatorial class that despised him and, after his death, needed a monster to justify getting rid of him. If Caligula's myth is about a horse, our second emperor's myth is about an instrument that, historically speaking, didn't even exist yet. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, a fire broke out in the merchant district near Rome's Circus Maximus. Fanned by summer winds and fed by densely packed wooden buildings, it burned for 6 days, destroying 3 of Rome's 14 districts, completely and seriously damaging 7 more. The legend that followed says Emperor Nero played his fiddle while he watched the city burn, utterly indifferent to the suffering below him. That's not a matter of historical debate, it's a matter of simple chronology. The fiddle, as an instrument, didn't exist in the ancient world at all. It wouldn't be developed for roughly 1,000 years. What the earlier sources actually say is more modest and far more uncertain. The historian Tacitus, who was alive at the time, though only a small child, records only a rumor that Nero sang about the destruction of Troy while watching the fire from a private stage, and Tacitus explicitly notes this was unconfirmed. He doesn't claim to know it's true. The more significant historical fact, one that rarely makes it into the popular version in the story, is that Nero wasn't even in Rome when the fire started. He was 35 miles away, at his villa in Antium. When word reached him, he returned immediately and, according to the same ancient sources that preserve the fiddle rumor, organized emergency shelter for displaced citizens, opened his own gardens to refugees, and arranged for grain to be brought in at reduced prices to prevent famine in the fire's aftermath. So, why does the fiddle story exist at all? Partly because Nero genuinely did love music and considered himself a serious performer on the cithara, an actual stringed instrument of the era, which made the accusation land as more plausible than it might have otherwise. And partly because the historians who preserved the story, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, were all writing after the fall of Nero's entire dynasty, under emperors who had every political reason to blacken his memory permanently. None of this makes Nero an innocent, misunderstood ruler. He is separately, reliably documented as having ordered the murder of his own mother, Agrippina the Younger, after a falling out over his growing independence from her influence. And, in the aftermath of the fire, he needed someone to blame for the disaster and its rebuilding costs. He chose a small, unpopular religious minority in Rome, the city's Christians, dozens of whom he had executed. Some reportedly burned alive as human torches to light his own gardens at night. That atrocity is not myth. It's one of the better documented cruelties of his entire reign, which tells you something important. The real Nero didn't need an invented fiddle to be genuinely dangerous. Our third emperor never wanted the crowds, the spectacle, or even Rome itself, and his decision to disappear entirely is exactly what turned him into one of antiquity's most notorious names. Tiberius became emperor in 14 AD at 54 years old, already an experienced and capable military commander, and for over a decade he ruled with what historians generally agree was competent, if joyless, administration. Then, in 26 AD, he did something almost no Roman emperor had done before. He left. He withdrew to the island of Capri, off the coast near Naples, and would never set foot in Rome again for the remaining 11 years of his life and reign. What Tiberius actually did on Capri is one of the murkiest questions in Roman history. The ancient sources, again, primarily Suetonius, writing roughly a century after the fact, describe an elderly recluse indulging in extraordinary private vice, hosting what Suetonius calls secret orgies in specially constructed pleasure gardens, attended by hand-picked companions. I want to be careful with the specifics here, because Suetonius's account gets genuinely graphic, and modern historians treat much of it with real skepticism. Not necessarily because none of it happened, but because Suetonius openly admits he's repeating rumor and gossip from a class of Roman elites who despised Tiberius for abandoning them and ruling from a distance. What we can verify independently paints a different, arguably darker picture. Tiberius's final decade was defined less by pleasure than by paranoia. For years, Tiberius had governed Rome almost entirely through a single trusted deputy, the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, until Tiberius discovered Sejanus had been quietly maneuvering to seize power for himself, and had likely murdered Tiberius's own son, Drusus, years earlier to clear his path. Tiberius had Sejanus arrested and executed within a single day, and according to Suetonius, didn't leave his villa for 9 months afterward. What followed was a documented wave of treason trials against anyone suspected of loyalty to the fallen prefect, a genuine reign of fear, verified independently by the historian Tacitus, who had access to Senate records as a former senator himself. Tiberius died in 37 AD at 77 years old, having spent over a third of his reign never once returning to the city he governed. When news of his death reached Rome, crowds reportedly shouted, "To the Tiber with Tiberius!" a demand that his body be thrown into the river rather than given proper burial. Whatever actually happened on that island, the isolation itself was enough to make him one of history's most feared old men. Our final emperor didn't need historians to invent stories about him. He simply renamed the entire empire after himself, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Commodus became co-emperor alongside his father, the famously wise philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, in 177 AD, and sole ruler upon his father's death 3 years later, at just 19 years old. Where his father had governed through restraint and stoic philosophy, Commodus governed through spectacle, and increasingly through delusion. Early in his reign, his own sister Lucilla conspired with a group of senators to have him killed. The plot failed. Commodus had Lucilla executed, and, by most historical accounts, the paranoia that followed never really left him. He grew increasingly convinced of his own divinity, eventually declaring himself the living reincarnation of the demigod Hercules, dressing in a lion's skin, carrying a wooden club, and commissioning statues of himself throughout the city in the god's image. When fire devastated large sections of Rome in 191 AD, Commodus saw not a disaster, but an opportunity. He personally oversaw the reconstruction and then renamed the entire city Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. Roman citizens were to be called Commodiani. He didn't stop at the city. He renamed all 12 months of the calendar after his own collection of imperial titles, and, according to the ancient historian Cassius Dio, even ordered that the Roman Senate itself be renamed in his honor. Perhaps most infamous of all, Commodus personally entered the Colosseum to fight as a gladiator, a role considered beneath the dignity of any Roman citizen, let alone an emperor. He killed lions, elephants, and even a hippopotamus with bow and arrow from a raised, protected platform, and fought staged, non-lethal bouts against opponents, including, according to some accounts, gladiators with physical disabilities, deliberately mismatched to guarantee his own victory. He fought hundreds of these contests and, unsurprisingly, never lost a single one. By late 192 AD, Commodus was planning to formally take office as consul on New Year's Day, dressed as a gladiator, marching to the Senate directly from his personal gladiatorial school, a spectacle even his closest allies reportedly found politically unsurvivable. On December 31st, the night before that ceremony, a group of conspirators, including his own mistress, chamberlain, and Praetorian prefect, had him poisoned. When the poison failed to kill him quickly enough, they sent in his wrestling partner to strangle him in his bath. He was 31 years old. 2,000 years of retelling has blurred every one of these men into a single word, mad, when the real story, in every single case, is more complicated, more political, and in its own way, more human than the legend. Tell me which of these four you'd believed the myth about before today. And if you want the deep dive on any other Roman emperor, tell me in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time.